enforcement officer for the federal government stopped up by this Texas ranch one day. He walked up to the farmer. He says, I need to inspect your ranch to make sure not any illegally grown drugs. And the rancher says, okay. He says, you can look anywhere you want. He says, but I wouldn't advise you go in that field over there. And the drug officer says, well, mister, let me tell you. He says, I got the power of the United States government behind me. He says, he pulls his badge out of his pocket and he says, I can go anywhere I want, anytime I want, on anybody's land. He says, do you understand? The rancher says, okay, well, have it your way. And he goes about his work. A short time later, he notices this agent darting through this field screaming at the top of his lungs, and he's being chased by this huge Brahma bull. And so the rancher throws his tools down, runs over to the fence, and he says, show him your badge! Show him your badge! Just a couple more here. Let's see, we've got a toddler, a teenager, a Texas rancher. We might as well get religion and the government out of the way. Pope Benedict was at Yankee Stadium with President Obama, and they were on the stage, and there were thousands of people there waiting on the two of them to speak. And the Pope leans over to the president and he says, do you know that with one little wave of my hand, I can make every person in this stadium go wild with joy, and the joy will be it won't be a momentary display. It'll go deep into their hearts, and they'll forever speak of this day. The president says, really? He says, I kind of like to see that. So the Pope backhanded him and knocked him off the stage. Speaking of Billy, a few years ago, my friend Billy Murphy, several years back, decided he's going to go on a singles cruise. And so he goes on this cruise, and he meets this nice young lady, and we'll just call her Nancy. You haven't had one of those, have you? We'll call her Nancy. So he meets Nancy, and they hit it off. And in a very short time into the cruise, he realizes that Nancy is from Wichita, and boy, he couldn't believe it. So they, of course, come home and strike up a relationship, and in a very short time, Billy thought, you know, it's time to maybe take this to the next level. So he gets the ring in a little box, and they get to talking, and he says, Nancy, I think it's time to think about taking our relationship to the next level. But before I give you what's in this box, there's something you really need to know about me. And she says, well, what's that? And he says, well, he says, I love to golf. I read about golf. I dream about golf. I play every chance I get. I watch it on TV. Are you prepared to be with a guy like that? And she says, well, yeah, that's okay. She says, but there's something you might want to know about me too. He says, well, what's that? And she goes, well, for the last 5 years, I've been a hooker. He says, oh, he bows his head for a minute. He thinks about it. He says, well, maybe that's because you're not keeping your wrists straight. Last but not least, let's see, we picked on the toddler, the teenager, religion, politics, Billy. We might as well get the elderly out of the way. This older gentleman, clearly older gentleman, balding and nothing but white hair, walks into a jewelry store one day with his very young girlfriend on his arm. And the jeweler looks at him, and he could tell right away there was quite an age difference here. You know, we're talking maybe 40 years. And the older gentleman walks up and he says, I'm looking for a special ring for my girlfriend. So he reaches in the cabinet, pulls out a ring. It's got a price tag on it, about $5,000 and says, well, what do you think of this? And the older gentleman looked at it and he says, well, he says, I really think I want something even more special. The jeweler says, okay. So he goes down to the next cabinet and gets out another ring. This one's got a price tag of $40,000. And the older gentleman looks at it and he says, that's going to work just fine. The jeweler says, well, hey, that's great. He says, how is it that you would like to handle payment for this? And the old guy says, well, you know, I really prefer to write a check. And this happened to be on like a Friday evening, and he says, I know that you're not just going to take my check. He says, so why don't I write you a check, and you take it and hold it over the weekend, and on Monday you can call my bank, verify the funds are there. I'll stop in Monday afternoon, pick up the ring. The jeweler says, well, that'll work just fine. So Monday morning rolls around, old man's phone rings, and it's a jeweler, and he's just mad as heck, and he says, sir, I've just called your bank, and you don't have that much money in your bank account. The old fella says, well, I know that. He says, but if you got a few minutes, I can tell you about the great weekend I just had.